We just saw an explosive air. There's almost about 16,000 feet or something like that. It just went down to the water.
On July 17, 1996, a tragic event shook the aviation world. TWA Flight 800, a Boeing 747-131, exploded mid-air over the Atlantic Ocean near Long Island, New York. The crash, which claimed the lives of all 230 people on board, remains one of the most perplexing and controversial incidents in aviation history. This disaster, although nearly 3 decades old, continues to provoke discussion, raising questions about the causes, the investigation, and its lasting effects on aviation policy. On that day, TWA Flight 800 was just 12 minutes into its flight, from John F. Kennedy International Airport, JFK, to Paris when disaster struck. In this video, we'll dive deep into this complex case study, examining everything from the sequence of events leading to the explosion, to the extensive investigation that followed, the public's perception of air travel afterward, and the reforms that resulted from the tragedy. We'll also touch on the theories that surrounded the crash and how they persist even today. Before we explore the details, let's start with a brief overview of the flight, its aircraft, and the people on board. The aircraft, Boeing 747-131, TWA. Flight 800 was a part of Transworld Airlines' regular operations, one of the most recognized names in American aviation. The aircraft involved in the incident was a Boeing 747-131, a wide-body commercial airliner, first introduced in the early 1970s. The 747-131 model had long been a reliable option for long-haul international flights, capable of carrying hundreds of passengers across the globe. This particular aircraft, registered as N93119, had been in service for approximately 25 years before the crash. It was a well-maintained, relatively old aircraft, with a strong track record. The 747-131 is equipped with 4 powerful engines, a spacious cabin, and a center fuel tank, located just behind the cockpit and under the fuselage. The 747 series, despite being a massive aircraft, was generally considered to be robust and able to withstand a variety of flight conditions. Despite its age, the aircraft had undergone rigorous maintenance and was certified for flight by the FAA, with no immediate signs of mechanical failure. At the time of the crash, the Boeing 747-131 was considered a proven workhorse of international aviation, but the events of that evening would forever alter the perception of air travel safety. The crew and passengers on board TWA Flight 800 were 230 souls. Of these, 16 were crew members: Captain James S. Sweeney, a seasoned pilot with over 13,000 hours of flight experience, First Officer Kenneth W. Jenkins, and Flight Engineer Robert R. Schulman, along with 13 other flight attendants. The crew was well versed in handling long-haul international flights and had undergone extensive training. They had also participated in regular safety drills, which would be vital in handling emergency situations, though this situation would be beyond any training they could have imagined. The passengers on board ranged from business people to tourists and families. Among the passengers were several Americans returning home from vacation and a number of young travellers, as well as tourists from around the world. Some notable passengers included a group of teenagers returning from a youth trip, a father and his children, and a honeymooning couple. The flight was operating at peak capacity, a normal aspect of summer travel. There was nothing to suggest that this flight, a common transatlantic route, would be anything other than routine. Takeoff and initial stages of the flight TWA Flight 800 took off from JFK International Airport at 8:19 p.m, making its way into the evening sky with clear weather and mild winds. The initial ascent was smooth. The aircraft climbed to an altitude of approximately 13,000 feet, a common cruising level for a flight that had just begun its journey across the Atlantic Ocean. The crew communicated with air traffic control, reporting normal flight conditions as expected. For the first few minutes, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Passengers were settling in for a typical flight, relaxing in their seats, perhaps watching movies or chatting among themselves. The crew, meanwhile, went about their duties, ensuring that everything was in order. The flight path took the aircraft out over the Atlantic, towards the southern part of Long Island, New York. The calm night skies gave no indication that anything was amiss. Yet, just 12 minutes into the flight, disaster struck. The moment of the explosion. 8:31 p.m., just 12 minutes into the flight, TWA Flight 800 exploded mid-air. The explosion was so powerful that it was visible to witnesses as far as Connecticut, and parts of the aircraft were seen falling into the E. Atlantic Ocean. Eyewitnesses along Long Island reported seeing a streak of light in the sky just before the explosion. Some witnesses even described hearing a loud boom and feeling a shockwave. It was described as a fireball that lit up the night sky. In the moments that followed, the plane's fuselage shattered into pieces and the aircraft rapidly descended. Multiple reports from witnesses along the coast claimed to have seen a light streaking upward before the explosion. Some speculated it was a missile, a theory that gained momentum as the explosion was so sudden and violent. The witnesses were unaware that what they were witnessing was the result of the aircraft's fuel tank explosion, not a missile strike. These initial observations would later play a crucial role in shaping the investigation into the cause of the crash. As the wreckage fell into the ocean, emergency teams from the Coast Guard, the NTSB, and the FBI immediately began their search for survivors, but it was soon clear that there were no survivors. The destruction was total. Recovery operations began almost immediately, but the vastness of the search area posed significant challenges. The search and recovery efforts, the immediate aftermath of the explosion, saw a massive response. The Coast Guard was among the first on the scene, deploying ships and aircraft to locate the wreckage. The debris was scattered over a large area, making recovery efforts difficult. Teams worked tirelessly, sifting through the waters, but the priority was not only to recover wreckage, but also to begin investigating the cause of the explosion. The NTSB, once it took the lead, would have to piece together the wreckage to understand the nature of the explosion and determine whether it was caused by mechanical failure, sabotage, or something else. The search continued for several days, with thousands of pieces of wreckage recovered from the ocean floor. Over the course of weeks, investigators sifted through the debris, and the bodies of the victims were recovered. This was a heartbreaking process, made all the more difficult by the sheer size of the wreckage and the complexity of identifying the remains. Initial theories in the days that followed, many initial theories surfaced regarding the cause of the explosion. The most significant theory was that the crash had been caused by a bomb or a missile. Given the suddenness of the explosion and the reports of a streak of light in the sky, many believed the aircraft might have been shot down, either intentionally or accidentally. Others speculated that a bomb had been planted on board the aircraft, especially given the political climate of the time. As investigators worked to rule out various causes, the FBI and NTSB began to focus on the possibility of sabotage. They questioned passengers, examined records, and worked with the military to check whether the explosion could have been caused by external forces. Despite these initial theories, there was no evidence to suggest a missile strike or bomb, and as more evidence was gathered, the scope of the investigation narrowed. The role of the NTSB and FBI. The NTSB took the lead on investigating the cause of the crash, with the FBI working alongside it to examine potential criminal activity. The NTSB's job was to determine the technical cause of the explosion, while the FBI investigated the possibility of terrorism or sabotage. As investigators scoured the wreckage, they found no signs of a missile or bomb. But what they did find would lead them down a different path. The flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder were recovered, which provided vital information about the flight's final moments. The cockpit voice recorder captured the last minutes of conversation between the flight crew, and the flight data recorder revealed crucial data about the aircraft's systems leading up to the explosion. As investigators began analysing the wreckage, they noticed something that would become critical to the investigation. The wreckage showed signs of an internal explosion. This suggested that the aircraft had not been shot down or bombed, but rather that something inside the plane had caused the catastrophic event. Center fuel tank explosion. The breakthrough came when investigators focused on the center fuel tank. The center tank was located directly beneath the fuselage, and it contained thousands of gallons of highly volatile fuel. The tank's design was relatively basic at the time, and it lacked the safety features that modern aircraft now use to prevent such explosions. The NTSB determined that a spark inside the fuel tank had caused the explosion. This spark was likely the result of a short circuit in the aircraft's electrical wiring, which had caused a failure in the tank's wiring system. The spark ignited the highly flammable vapours inside the fuel tank, leading to a massive explosion that ultimately tore the aircraft apart. This conclusion was backed up by several key pieces of evidence, including the position of the wreckage, the flight data recorder, and the analysis of the electrical systems. However, this finding was controversial and did not fully satisfy everyone involved. Critics of the investigation continued to point to the missile theory and other possible causes. The missile theory and public perception. As the NTSB report concluded that the crash was caused by a spark in the fuel tank, many members of the public refused to accept this explanation. The missile theory remained a persistent issue, fueled by eyewitness accounts of a streak of light before the explosion. This, combined with the possibility of terrorist attacks during the 1990s, led many to believe that the crash was caused by something external. Despite the overwhelming evidence against the missile theory, conspiracy theorists continued to push the idea that the US government had covered up the true cause of the crash. Some speculated that the US Navy had accidentally shot down the plane during a training exercise, and the government had chosen to keep it quiet. Others questioned the thoroughness of the investigation, wondering if certain lines of inquiry were intentionally ignored. The NTSB, however, stood firm on its conclusion that the crash was the result of an internal fuel tank explosion caused by electrical wiring. Despite public skepticism, the investigation's findings were based on solid evidence. Aviation safety reforms. The explosion of TWA Flight 800 had a profound impact on aviation safety, especially concerning fuel tank safety. Following the incident, the NTSB recommended that all commercial aircraft be equipped with inerting systems in their fuel tanks to reduce the risk of ignition. This technology replaces oxygen with nitrogen, making the fuel vapour less likely to ignite. The FAA implemented these recommendations, and by the early 2000s, all commercial airliners were required to be retrofitted with inerting systems. This change drastically reduced the chances of a similar disaster occurring in the future. Wiring and electrical system improvements. The investigation also highlighted the need for changes to aircraft wiring systems. The electrical failure that led to the spark inside the centre fuel tank became a focal point of the investigation, and the NTSB's findings led to changes in how wiring systems were designed and maintained. Manufacturers like Boeing and Airbus revised their designs to improve insulation and wiring configurations, reducing the risk of short circuits. These new standards were adopted worldwide, and many older aircraft were retrofitted with the updated wiring systems to improve safety. The immediate shock and public response. When TWA Flight 800 exploded, it was a shock to everyone, especially the public. At that time, air travel was seen as one of the safest modes of transportation, and events like these were exceedingly rare. The explosion, visible across Long Island and reported by eyewitnesses, sparked fear and confusion. People questioned, how could something like this happen? Could it happen to any of us? The early media coverage of the crash only compounded the public's anxieties. As reports began to surface, speculation about the cause of the explosion ran rampant. Many news outlets focused on the theories of terrorism and sabotage. The 1990s had seen a series of high-profile terrorism-related incidents, including the bombing of Pan Am Flight 103 in 1988, so the idea of a bomb being responsible for TWA Flight 800's destruction seemed plausible to many. This uncertainty about the cause of the explosion led to a period of fear and doubt about flying. People started asking questions about the safety of air travel, particularly in the United States. Was it really as safe as the industry had been promoting? Could there be hidden dangers that the public wasn't aware of? These fears and questions led to a temporary decline in the public's confidence in flying. The missile theory, for instance, took hold because of the vivid eyewitness testimonies of a streak of light in the sky just before the explosion. These reports led many people to believed that the plane had been shot down by a missile. The combination of emotional witness accounts and the media's sensationalistic approach to covering these theories fueled public confusion and uncertainty about the true cause of the disaster. Rebuilding trust in aviation. However, as more evidence from the investigation became available, and the NTSB concluded that the cause of the explosion was an internal electrical spark within the center fuel tank, the aviation industry moved quickly to reassure the public. Airline executives, along with government officials, made public statements underscoring that the incident was isolated and that safety measures were being enhanced to prevent such disasters in the future. Despite these assurances, rebuilding trust in air travel wasn't easy. People who had once flown without hesitation now had doubts about the reliability of their aircraft. News reports continued to dwell on the theories surrounding the explosion, and some individuals, especially those with loved ones involved in the crash, could not accept the final conclusion of the NTSB. For them, the truth had not been fully revealed. Over time, as the industry introduced stricter safety measures and more transparency in investigations, public confidence slowly began to return. However, it took years for the public to feel fully reassured that air travel was just as safe as it had been before the disaster. The TWA Flight 800 tragedy, therefore, served as a stark reminder of the risks involved in air travel, but also catalyzed much-needed safety reforms. Impact on aviation safety. The impact of TWA Flight 800 on aviation safety was profound. The NTSB's investigation into the explosion ultimately led to groundbreaking changes in aircraft design, maintenance, and operational procedures. Most notably, the tragedy highlighted the need to address the vulnerabilities in fuel tank safety. Before the explosion of Flight 800, aircraft fuel tanks were designed to vent fuel vapors into the atmosphere, creating a potentially dangerous situation if a spark ignited those vapors. In the aftermath of the crash, the NTSB recommended the introduction of inerting systems for fuel tanks. These systems work by replacing oxygen with nitrogen, making it much harder for fuel vapors to ignite. These systems became mandatory for new aircraft designs, and older aircraft were retrofitted with the new technology. This change drastically reduced the risk of fuel tank explosions on commercial flights. Another major improvement was in the wiring systems of aircraft. The NTSB's investigation revealed that the spark that caused the explosion was a result of an electrical short. As a result, the NTSB recommended more rigorous wiring standards and better insulation in aircraft wiring systems. These recommendations led to industry-wide improvements that made electrical systems more durable and reliable. Safety reforms in aviation protocols. One of the most significant impacts of the TWA Flight 800 disaster was the overhaul of safety regulations and investigative protocols. The event exposed the aviation industry's vulnerabilities and prompted aviation authorities worldwide to re-examine existing safety standards. For example, the Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, imposed new requirements for the inspection of wiring systems and fuel tanks. Airlines were required to conduct more frequent checks to identify potential issues before they could cause catastrophic failures. Additionally, the FAA began to enforce more rigorous safety measures regarding the maintenance of electrical systems. These changes created a ripple effect that affected not just US airlines, but global aviation practices. Furthermore, in the wake of the crash, aviation regulators also started pushing for greater transparency in safety investigations. The TWA Flight 800 disaster raised questions about the secrecy surrounding the details of high-profile investigations, and the industry learned valuable lessons about how to better communicate findings to the public in a clear and timely manner. Creating a safer aviation future. Overall, TWA Flight 800 was a catalyst for significant advancements in aviation safety. While the crash resulted in an immeasurable loss, the reforms and policies that followed have saved countless lives. The changes made in response to the tragedy have had lasting benefits not just for the airline industry, but also for the passengers who now board planes with a greater sense of security. The tragedy of Flight 800 served as a stark reminder that, Safety should always be the top priority, and it led to a new era of safety consciousness in aviation. The influence on public consciousness. TWA Flight 800's cultural impact extends far beyond just the immediate aftermath. The explosion and the subsequent investigation brought the issue of air safety into the forefront of public consciousness. Before the crash, air travel had become an ordinary part of life, with many people unaware of the complexities and risks involved in keeping an aircraft safely in the air. After the crash, the reality of aviation safety was scrutinized more intensely, and the public began to take a deeper interest in how airplanes were maintained and how safety protocols were designed. It wasn't just about getting from point A to point B anymore. It was about understanding how much effort goes into ensuring that flights operate smoothly and securely. As the years went on, more documentaries, books and media reports brought the story of TWA Flight 800 to the public's attention. Even today, the crash continues to be a topic of conversation. Documentaries like The Final Report, TWA Flight 800, and books like TWA Flight 800. The crash, the cover-up, and the conspiracy have kept the story alive in popular culture, with people still trying to unpack the full details of the incident and its aftermath. While conspiracy theories surrounding the crash continue to persist, the mainstream narrative remains focused on the NTSB's findings. Regardless of the differing opinions, the story of TWA Flight 800 remains a significant chapter in the history of aviation. The ongoing fight for transparency. One of the lasting effects of TWA Flight 800 has been the ongoing fight for transparency in aviation investigations. The incident highlighted the importance of clear communication between authorities and the public, especially in high-profile cases where misinformation can easily spread. The FBI's involvement in the investigation, along with the initial theories of missile strikes and terrorism, created a sense of confusion and mistrust among the public. In response, the NTSB has since worked hard to ensure that future investigations are conducted with greater clarity and openness. The families of the victims, many of whom have fought tirelessly for greater transparency and accountability, played a crucial role in this shift. They have been vocal in advocating for improved safety measures, more stringent regulations, and better communication with the public regarding the outcomes of aviation investigations. Their work continues to inspire those in the aviation industry and regulatory bodies to prioritize safety and transparency at every level. Looking back on TWA Flight 800, we see how a tragic event led to profound changes in the aviation industry. The explosion was a devastating loss, but it served as a catalyst for crucial reforms that have made air travel safer today. The introduction of inerting systems in fuel tanks, improvements to wiring systems, and stricter safety protocols are all direct results of the lessons learned from Flight 800. In addition to these technical improvements, the crash underscored the importance of transparency and public trust. The battle for greater openness in aviation investigations continues today, ensuring that tragedies like TWA Flight 800 don't fade into obscurity. But beyond the technical changes, the most enduring legacy of TWA Flight 800 may be the reminder it offers us about the fragility of life and the need to constantly improve safety. The memory of the victims, along with the efforts of their families, reminds us that safety in aviation isn't just about regulations and procedures. It's about people, lives, and the responsibility to keep them safe. Today, flying is safer than ever, and the improvements in aviation safety brought about by the TWA Flight 800 tragedy continue to benefit millions of people around the world. We owe it to the lives lost on that fateful night and to the loved ones they left behind to ensure that their deaths were not in vain. Thank you for joining us as we explored the story of TWA Flight 800. If you found this video informative, please like, comment and subscribe for more in-depth analyses of historical events. Until next time, stay safe, stay informed, and never stop asking the hard questions.